Good day, everyone. So, is Genshin storytelling too repetitive? Now, it's often been said from Archon Quest to character story quest that there's too much unnecessary dialogue and that the characters could just get the point across a lot quicker. They're just too static, standing still, and you just have to read through a mountain of dialogue. It's almost like being back at school. And I personally completely disagree with this. So, the thing that you've got to remember in Genshin is you've got a lot of characters, and having a large cast of characters means you need to properly characterize these characters directly and indirectly. So, directly would be with the words that they say. So, a lot of the times you might say, well, why is a character speaking in a certain way? Couldn't they have just said the same thing in a more simplified or a different way? And the thing is, well, it matters how they say it, the words they choose. The sort of length of dialogue is like very carefully written to sort of accentuate this character's way of speaking and giving you a bit more insight into the character themselves. I completely disagree that the game should only be about optimizing how quickly we can tell the story to get our primo gems. I feel like the very fact that the game gives you this additional dialogue should very well characterize sort of what a character's speech is, their thought patterns, etc., etc. And from my perspective, as someone that plays in Japanese, I listened quite a lot to the pronouns, to the verb usage, to the different dialects, to the way the characters phrase a lot of the things. So I don't just read the subtitles or sometimes the kanji as well. I very, very intently listen to how the characters are saying this sort of things. And I feel that from someone that plays sort of mostly the Japanese version, it's really done well. So it's not, for me, it's not just a bunch of boring dialogue, but it's how that dialogue is delivered, which is really, really interesting. And of course, the characters themselves delivering it gives you a lot of perspective. But what's even more interesting is also understanding how the characters in the game give you indirect information about themselves. So that would be, how do they interact with NPCs? What do NPCs tell them about themselves? So let's take the Raiden Shogun story quest as an example. In the story, she meets her past companions, most notably the samurai and the old man. And what's interesting about this interaction isn't that it's a bunch of useless dialogue, but because it characterizes Raiden in a very different way. So far, we haven't seen Raiden really interacting with her people, understanding what her people expect from her. But here you can see she's met this old man before. She knows exactly who he is. Even after 500 years, she can recall his name and all of that. And that is really remarkable. And it's the same from the warriors that she meets later on. They all sort of have their expectations, their ambitions, their hopes sort of entrusted to the Raiden herself, which just makes it all the more painful when you realize that Raiden essentially shut out her own subjects' sort of dreams and ideals when she went into the plane of Euphemia. It wasn't just a personal decision, she literally sort of averted her own subjects' dreams and so on. And that is quite powerful. It starts to hit like a bit harder. But what's even more so, or what was very interesting for me from the dialogue, is how Raiden's perceptions and perspectives on eternity started changing from interacting with them. It's almost like she was starting to see the world from Makoto, her sister's like viewpoint and lens, by talking to her subjects. And this led to quite a bit of enormous character growth, and eventually the resolve for Raiden to not just carry her own ambitions but her people's ambitions when fighting the puppet for 500 years. And I think that was like excellent storytelling. And what's even more so is the fact that this storytelling was very gradual. As she was interacting with her subjects, the puppet inside of her started to reject her body more and more, like sort of rejected A more and more. And that's because her resolve or her ideal, or what she sees eternity, or what she thinks eternity should really mean, has started to change quite significantly, and it was affected by these very dialogues. So hopefully I convinced you that in a very more or like indirect way, the environment and the NPCs around Raiden affected her. And that is what good storytelling is. That is how you set up the world building and the characterization. So it's not just pointless dialogue. And that is the thing that I want to tell you guys. The direct and the indirect is so important when assessing these things. Are there times in the story where there's like a bit of just plain world building where it's not just that important? Yeah, we all know the Madam Ping and her sort of things that she tells. There's sometimes in a certain sense you get like a bit of light characterizations. In other words, you just have like story building for the sake of just enhancing the world, giving you a bit of a better feel as to how everything around you goes. And this is pretty normal from a storytelling perspective. You can't always just have the hard hitting truths or like the deep sort of lore and whatever. You as a person needs to have a break. It's like, especially if you've read like light novels, you can't just be constantly surprised. There is a very deliberate downtime mechanism that plays very well into good stories. And if everything was just constant action, just get to the point, just give it to me so that I can get my primo gem sort of style, then Genshin would lose quite a lot of the flavor and nuance that's sort of present. And that's sort of my criticism against people saying that the stories and the dialogues and all these things are just like too boring and so on. And I think what this stems from is something that I would consider to be the major criticism of Genshin, and that is the story pacing. And I don't mean an individual sort of story by itself. I mean as a collective. Genshin Impact and its world building is very uneven, precisely because it's a game. There's no sense of I'm watching this movie or I'm watching this series. I'm now at episode 15. Now I'm going to go to 18 this weekend and whatever. You've got 6 weeks or even months where a certain story thread is dragging on. You've got all these story chapters, and I think the biggest failing for me in Genshin Impact is how unrelated all of these are. And I think this is what leads people to have like a bit of a drag, because you don't see the full interactive, like between all the characters, characterization that needs to happen. What you only see is a certain character, how they interact with NPCs and so on, and the richness from the greater world building is kind of lost, which is in a certain sense quite sad for me. I feel as though the content release and the story release, I feel like it's a bit too slow. It's almost like you've almost forgotten the sort of like the pain points or the those elements in the story that really matters by the time a new Archon quest comes out. And that is where I felt that the leeway section was a bit better than the Inazuman section, because it almost felt like with every patch we're growing, we're progressing, we're going. And then within Inazuma there was almost this bit of silence, like, so for instance after Kokomi's banner, we had like radio silence for a couple of months, and then we had the Archon quest. So what I'm trying to say is Genshin Impact's failure is not the content of the story quest and so on, it's the fact that the pacing of when these story quests are released is kind of problematic, and it's going to make the game feel like just a big melting pot, or just like it's just going to feel like a big mess at the end of the day as we get more and more characters. That's just my sort of intuitive feel about it. But yeah, guys, that is sort of all I have to say about Genshin Story. One, if they do it right, it really hits well. But I do think overall pacing issues is ultimately what's going to lead to this game feeling like a slog, and then hence why people complain. Cheers.